Welcome to the Earning Freedom Podcast. I am Michael Santos with michaelsantos.com and prisonprofessor.com. We strive every day to present inspiring messages that people who have faced the criminal justice system or served time in prison can emerge successfully. Sometimes I share strategies that empowered me through the 26 years that I served. Sometimes I interview formerly incarcerated individuals who achieved success despite their imprisonment. And sometimes I interview business leaders. Today, I am really excited because I get to interview and present you with an amazing success story. I am going to be introducing you to Dino Steiny, currently a student at San Francisco State University, but soon to be a PhD student at UCLA. So it's an extraordinary story. I want you to hear about it. Dino, welcome to the Earning Freedom Network. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you into the prison system to begin with?
Hi, Michael, and thank you for this opportunity. So as a young man, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I made the choices that tended to be commonplace for young men at that point in time. I grew up, I'm 37 years old, and I grew up in a city that was predominantly African-American, and in an era when crack cocaine had made inroads into the urban settings in America. So I had choices set in front of me that were pretty clear cut. A minimum wage job, if I could get it, versus an economy within the inner cities of America that was vibrant at the time, albeit a very negative one in hindsight. I ended up in a cocaine conspiracy. At the federal level, I was prosecuted, and I was offered a 13-year sentence. And in avoidance of a far greater sentence, I ended up pleading guilty to 13 years and ended up in federal prison.
Dino, let me ask you a couple of questions. So you'd said that it was an African-American community. Are you from the Are you an African-American?
I am.
And were you raised did you find a lot of criminal influences around you besides what you just described? I mean, did you have personal connections to crime when you were growing up?
I did. I started very early in my criminal career. I guess in the city, you grow up kind of fast. So about 10 to 12 years old, the first time I saw crack cocaine, I was 13 or 12. And I started stealing cars and breaking into cars and selling marijuana and crack cocaine at an early age.
Well, I got to tell you, you are not alone in that, Dino. A lot of us made some bad decisions when we were young, but very few of us were able to really overcome it in the way that you have, in such an extraordinary way, where you're soon on your way to one of the best universities in the United States, pursuing your PhD. Before we get to how you really achieved that level of success, can I ask you a little bit about your journey through federal prison?
Of course.
So when you started serving your term for 13 plus years, tell us a little bit about where you went and what type of mindset you had when you started.
Well, fortunate for me, let me start off by saying that DC inmates, DC prisoners, incarcerated people from Washington, D.C. rather, end up being funneled into the federal system because we don't have a state-run prison any longer.
Were you convicted under the DC code or under the federal code?
I was convicted under the federal code, but they tend to send DC inmates all over the federal system.
Right.
The rules regulating the federal system is that they're supposed to keep you within 800 miles of your release residence, and so. Unlike majority of the prisoners in the federal system, the DC prisoners, whether they're under DC code or federal code, tend to be sent all over the system. Beyond that, I was fortunate enough that my mother had retired to the Bay Area in California years before my incarceration, and So when I was arrested, I was convenient enough to give my mother's address, which actually brought me out into California to serve my time, because that was my release residence.
So where did you go in California? Lompoc?
I ended up going to Terminal Island.
And while you were at Terminal Island, when you walked in there, how old were you?
I was, 24.
So you said you're 30, so that was several years ago.
I'm sorry, excuse me. I was 20. Let me see.
That's okay. You're early to mid-20s.
Mid-20s, absolutely.
So back then, it was a medium security prison. Is that correct?
It was medium security prison, and they were actually in a process. They were changing the classification of the prison from medium to low over the first year that I was there.
Did you have any prior history with the Bureau of Prisons or the criminal justice system, or was this your first offense, or first time in prison?
First time incarcerated, but I had plenty of run-ins with the law. I was fortunate enough to have a good friend who was my attorney, who actually was very, very helpful in keeping me from being incarcerated through many years of my criminal history.
So when you got to Terminal Island, what type of a mindset did you have? Were you saying you wanted to turn your life around, or were you just running with the DC boys, or were you, what was your mindset while you were in there? Walk me through that.
When I walked into Terminal Island and I walked on the yard, it had been my first time being in prison, and looking around at the landscape of Terminal Island. It is somewhat intimidating. It's probably the most well-located federal prison in the nation, but it still is an island. And so when you think about it, you're driving on the bus and you arrive at an island and you see gun towers and barbed fences and razor wire, and it's an intimidating journey, certainly. When I walked onto the yard, I see all of the telltale signs that I had seen growing up with regard to gang activity and interactions on a street level. I saw people in groups that were oriented toward race, toward geography, because in the federal system you kind of are grouped by your area rather than your specific gang. And so what I'm looking at is I'm looking at DC federal prisoners coming and welcoming me and opening their arms and their friendship to me based upon the fact that I am from DC. And then I see many other factions that are, whether it be Crips or Bloods or Sureños or Norteños, all different factions of different groups that are in essence prison gangs. And so it's a moment filled with emotions of a variety of nervousness, unease, graciousness for the welcome that you get from the people that you are in essence aligned with. But when I entered into prison, I didn't know what to think, and I had very little desire to rectify my life. I just figured I'm going to do this time and go back to my neighborhood and probably end up being in the same situation that I had been in prior to.
I can tell you something. As a young man, I was about your age when I started serving my lengthy sentence, and I walked into the United States Penitentiary and experienced that same level of trepidation and concern. One of the messages that I heard repeatedly and routinely is that the strategy for surviving in prison is to forget about the world outside, focus on the world inside. I completely rejected that advice because it enabled me to start focusing on what I could do to prepare for success. Did you hear a similar message when you were beginning your journey, Dino? Did you hear that the best way to serve time is to forget about the world outside and just focus on time in prison? And if you did, let me know your thoughts on it now in retrospect, or if you didn't, let me know the messages that you were hearing about how to succeed in prison.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. The message that I got was basically, number one, mind your business. If it doesn't have something directly to do with you, don't be nosy about it. That's number one. That's the first rule of survival in the federal system, and I think in any prison. Mind your business. Next, basically, you have to let go of the connections that you have outside. I have a friend, close friend, who's still incarcerated, who had served 24 years as I exited the prison, and as I had been released, and he explained again and again that you no longer are in control like you were once in control on the street. You can't make a call and have somebody handle the things that you need handled, whether it be photos or taking money to the Western Union to send to you or what have you. You have to let go of that mindset of I'm in control, because you're no longer in control.
And do you, in retrospect, do you subscribe to that model, or do you have a different perspective now?
I think that my circle of influence certainly had changed. I was not able to make things happen in the same way that I had to. I had to have someone on the outside with legs to run errands or do the things that I needed done. So I certainly was, my hands were tied. But that being said, I didn't subscribe to the idea that I was not capable of doing anything.
How did you serve your time, Dino? What types of things did you work on while you were incarcerated?
Well, early on, I recognized that there was no incentive in the federal system to bring about change in people. I saw people watching Maury Povich and Jerry Springer for hours on end and stuck in the TV room. At the same time, I saw another group of individuals who were active in trying to make themselves better. And when I saw that, I said, this is where I need to be. This is who I need to be around. And so I'm Muslim. So I basically divided my time between exercising to try to stay healthy, my beliefs, my religion, which in essence was staying in the chapel, and the education that I wanted, that I strived to get. I dropped out at 15, so I needed to grow spiritually and intellectually. So I stayed in education department building, or I stayed in the chapel, or I was working out. And I avoided, like the plague, the television room. The TV room was the place that I stayed farthest away from.
So that's some excellent advice, Dino. That was certainly one of the strategies that helped me through my journey as well. Early on in my term, I was influenced by a great book called The Autobiography of Malcolm X. Did you have an opportunity to read that book?
Several times.
Yeah,
yes.
Tell us a little bit about how it influenced your journey through prison, because it sounds very much like you did the same thing as him. And again, I want to really express my respect and admiration for what you have done. It's amazing to go to prison with your background and your experiences, and then devote yourself to education and self-improvement. And so I just wanted to express my respect and admiration for you. But tell me a little bit about how Malcolm X's story influenced your journey.
So I'll tell you, I read the Autobiography of Malcolm X long before I ever went to prison, and it was a reality that he spoke to during the autobiography. That it was a reality that I had watched unfold for myself over the years of being on the street and the incarceration. I was in essence a dirtbag on the street. I was involved in all types of things, all types of criminal behavior. I ended up going to prison, I ended up searching and finding, during a long road, my faith and my love for God. And in essence, Malcolm used to talk about how the prison was our university. When I got to prison, I recognized that fact, and that resounded in my mind. It constantly was an effort to reflect upon where I was, where I had been, and where I wanted to get.
Are you saying, when you said that he said that prison was the university hour, are you referring to African Americans?
Not only African Americans, people of color in general.
Okay, so awesome. That's some great insight, and I would agree that prison should be a university for anybody who is experiencing it. The challenge that many people have is some look at it as a university of crime. You chose to look at it as a university for doing well. Tell us what you did with it with that guidance.
Well, let me speak to the statement that you made initially. Initially, when I went into prison, my intention was not to get a college degree. My intention was not to seek out this higher education and become part of academia in America. That was, and certainly not to protest the conditions in prison. My focus was to just do my time and go home. But my journey took me through a process, through a path of growth and nurtured me. My experience was what I drew strength from. Let me say this. In the federal system, there is no incentive for doing good. There's no parole. There's no good time credit that you can earn for going to school or for programming, in essence. And the problem for me was that when I initially started, I didn't have an incentive to bring me along. And halfway through, I kind of was I was discouraged. I said, why am I going through all this, wasting my time going through all this, if I'm not getting anything back from it, without realizing that what I was getting back from it was growth and expanding my mind. The problem, I think, is that most of the people in the federal system, for the most part, are not utilizing the programs because there's no incentive. I think that there needs to be an incentive return to the system in the form of good time credits or parole, so that people can be encouraged to get into school, because during that time in their educational process, that conversion can occur. That transition from I'm doing it for the time to I'm doing it to grow can occur, and that transition won't occur if you don't encourage people to get in to those programs.
Well, I can tell you one thing, Dino, you are a source of inspiration for many people who are listening to this podcast. Many of them are inside of prison, and when we hear your story, you will inspire those people, because they are going to hear right now about the extraordinary journey that you have had since concluding your obligation to the Bureau of Prisons. But I also want to say I am 100% with you that we need to see more incentives that encourage a pursuit of excellence like that you shown with your own adjustment through prison. Tell us about how your shift in behavior and shift in attitude influenced your life upon release.
Islam and being a Muslim really grounded me in prison, because it caused me to recognize that all of the things that I was chasing after on the street and in my prior life of being a criminal were, in essence, a waste of my time. They brought me away from the real essence of life, which is happiness and commitment to empowering people and improving people's condition. That being said, I think that upon my release, the most important aspect of my journey during prison was the development of my faith and the growth in my faith. While I was incarcerated, I was in a position, as many of the Muslims are in the federal system, to mediate several very difficult situations between different groups in prison. Different groups, different gangs, in essence, would come to the Muslims to try to get a clearer understanding with another faction or another group. And we ended up preventing, in my institution, we ended up preventing some very serious situations that had occurred, some very serious conflicts that had occurred between different groups. I'm grateful that I was able to do that, and I'm grateful that I was able to develop the diplomacy and the love of people just for the sake of loving people that allowed me to be able to transition onto the street with a very low desire for all of the material things that caused me to crash in the first place and end up becoming incarcerated. But also, I was very grateful for the diplomacy that I was able to develop through mediating these difficult disputes and through interacting with people who didn't necessarily like me, but respected me.
You know, I can say that without a doubt, there are skill sets that we all can enjoy and develop regardless of where we are, regardless of what bad decisions we have made in the past. And I'm sure that many tax-paying Americans are grateful also for the diplomacy that you developed, because it is that diplomacy that brings about safety and brings about community renewal and community growth. Tell us what you did after you concluded your obligation to the Bureau of Prisons. How has your life proceeded since you returned to society?
In the area of California where I live, in the federal probation district that I live in, there is what's called a high-risk reentry program. It's a pilot program that, in essence, is a program through probation that works with high-risk inmates, high-risk formerly incarcerated people, whom they term high-risk, I should say, that attempts to aid them in reentry. I have been instrumental in trying to aid in shaping that so that it can best help individuals coming home from prison. When I came home, I was fortunate enough to have a safety net, but many of the people who come home from prison don't have that safety net. So I developed, while incarcerated, and I am continuing to develop my nonprofit here in California that will aid not only at-risk youth in attempting to get them to become more engaged in society and put down the guns, so that we stop killing ourselves here in the inner cities of America, but also it has a component to aid and assist individuals coming home from prison to reintegrate into society. I think one of the big difficulties that I saw in anticipating my release was that I saw a young brother, and when I say young brother, I'm not just talking about African American people. I'm talking about young Latinos, and people who are not just young, individuals who make up the poorer segment of our society, or the more disenfranchised of our society, returning home into communities where their families were not any longer there, their communities were not ready for them, they had no support, and they ended up going to a halfway house with nothing. And I think that is the big issue that is fueling recidivism and is fueling the difficulties that we go through.
Without a doubt, and it's really important for those of us who have come back to society strong to share that message and to sow those seeds so that more people can emerge successfully. I'd really love for you to tell us about what you did to overcome the intergenerational cycles of failure that follow our nation's wrong-headed commitment to mass incarceration. Tell us specifically what you did, because I'd really like to get into, before this episode concludes, of where you're going next.
So while incarcerated, I ended up earning my associate's degree. Upon release, I recognized as a felon and a formerly incarcerated person that I had to set myself apart from the majority of the people who I had to set myself apart and distinguish myself among individuals as best as I could. Regardless if they were formerly incarcerated or people who were just in the workforce, I knew as a felon with a criminal history that I was not going to be looked at and viewed in our society as someone who had paid his debt with a clean slate. I was going to be viewed with the stigma of being a formerly incarcerated person. So I initially took an approach that I would establish myself as someone who was intellectually sound. And the best way to do that here in the United States is to get your degree. So I ended up entering into San Francisco State University, and I am poised to graduate in May. At that point, in my senior year, I recognized that I had an opportunity. I earned a 4.0 in my field of study. I have a 3.9 GPA overall at San Francisco State in 4 semesters. And so I realized that I was able to apply to some of the best universities in America and would likely be accepted into a PhD program despite my conviction, despite my criminal history. And that has proved true. I was accepted into the 9th ranked school in the United States, a school that is very active in reaching out to inner city communities and impoverished communities, both in Los Angeles and all over the United States. And they have a very strong commitment to improving the lot of Americans in general, but people who have traditionally been segregated and funneled into prisons, African American and Latino youth. That's my whole focus. Really, is trying to make an effort, trying to make an impact on the people that I am from and who I consider are most in need.
That is so inspiring. So you will soon begin your study at UCLA as a PhD candidate. What area of subject are you going to be pursuing, Dino?
Sociology.
And do you have aspirations of continuing in academia, or will you work in this really well-regarded nonprofit that you have begun?
Honestly, I think that several of the best schools in America have kind of joined sociology with public policy in a PhD and master's program. So you get a PhD in sociology and a master's in public policy. I think that it's important that people who study issues related to society and issues impacting segments of the society in a negative way are able to transition that information that they've learned to policy that will be implemented. I think it's fruitless to just study and pointless to just study issues and not have a real genuine mechanism to impact people based upon the knowledge that you gain from those studies. So not only do I intend to attempt to address issues at a public policy level, but also through my nonprofit, I hope to impact people's lives in a real grassroots way, right on the level where it impacts people immediately.
Can I ask the name of your nonprofit and how you are funding that nonprofit today?
You know, I'm back and forth. The name I think is going to be Decisions. I haven't officially filed the 501c here in California, but I'm in the process of working out all the kinks and getting everything situated. I think that I would look to philanthropic donations and fundraising. I'll also probably file for some grants. But ultimately, I'd like I'm sure you've heard of the term social entrepreneurship.
I have.
I think that the problem for a lot of us coming home from prison is that we have to compete in a job market where you have so many qualified applicants that have no criminal history. So I think that an effort toward developing entrepreneurship in persons who have been who are formerly incarcerated is an avenue that will impact people's lives in an amazing way. So I really do intend to try to aid and assist my brothers in seeking entrepreneurship and in seeking out business opportunities that will improve their lives and the lives of their families.
Well, certainly our nation's problem with mass incarceration and the hundreds of thousands of people who return to society every year will need your leadership and need your guidance. When you get down to Los Angeles and to begin your school, I want to connect you with Homeboy Industries and with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, two very large, well-funded nonprofits that I have worked with in the past, and I know that you could provide immense value to as well. I really want to thank you so much, Dino, for inspiring the guests, inspiring the listeners of the Earning Freedom Network. You are certainly a role model for anyone who is facing struggle, and you show us that we can always become more than the past bad decisions we have had. As we've come to the end of this episode of Earning Freedom Network, are there any last words that you would like to say to our listeners?
Absolutely. To the listeners who are incarcerated, never give up hope. Draw from your heart and your mind the strength to persevere. Never give up hope.
You are certainly somebody who gives us hope, Dino. I will provide some show notes to this episode on michaelsantos.com and at prisonprofessor.com, and I hope to provide some contact information for you, Dino, so that those who are interested in supporting your journey will know how to connect with you and how to support your mission of building a better society.
Absolutely. I will certainly make sure that I get that to you as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. This is another episode of Earning Freedom Network. I am Michael Santos with michaelsantos.com and prisonprofessor.com, and we look forward to bringing another inspiring guest tomorrow on the Earning Freedom Network.
Thank you for having me, Michael.